The eastern window allowed the first morning light to enter our bedroom. I recall that vividly because on our wedding night, I lay awake for hours watching the dark sky turn to a pale gray behind the curtain. I was 23 years old, and I had just married Jonas after 19 months of courtship. Our wedding had been massive, with 400 guests filling a barn that had been arranged with that immaculate, unadorned elegance that only a people dedicated to generations of refined simplicity can create. Throughout the day, women who had watched me grow up took turns whispering how blessed I was to have secured such a match. By every measurable standard in our district, Jonas was considered the finest catch of the season. He was known as an industrious worker, a deeply religious soul, exceptionally gentle with livestock, patient around infants, and held in high regard by community elders twice his age. When he had initially asked for my hand, my mother wept with sheer relief, not out of any worry for my own character, but because she recognized just how extraordinarily rare a man of his caliber truly was. I believed in that flawless image completely. Having observed him for nearly 2 years, I'd never witnessed a single flash of irritation, a sharp word to a neighbor, or even a hairline fracture in his remarkably placid demeanor. But that is the deception of a smooth exterior. You can examine it for a lifetime and remain entirely ignorant of what is buried beneath it. When the final well-wishers departed and the door closed, leaving Jonas and me completely alone in the modest home his father and uncles had erected for us during the spring months, I was blindsided by an unexpected sensation. In that space, entirely free from the collective gaze of our community for the first time, I did not feel the unalloyed joy that is supposed to define a wedding night. Instead, a distinct sense of dread crept over me. I must emphasize that this fear was not directed at him. This account does not involve physical threats or acts of malice, and it would completely misrepresent the truth of our life to let anyone imagine a darker, more conventional tale of abuse. What terrified me was simply the vast, overwhelming vacuum of the unknown. It was the sudden realization, in a silent house where the candlelight had dwindled, that I was now bound to a man around whom I had constructed my entire future, yet whom I did not actually comprehend in any deep way. That intuition proved to be entirely accurate, though the revelation manifested in a manner I never could have anticipated. To make sense of the moment our public performance of courtship dissolved into the stark reality of marriage, it helps to understand the world I came from and the person Jonas appeared to be. I spent my formative years in a Holmes County, Ohio district, raised in a household that balanced somewhere between rigid traditionalism and leniency, a middle path that many families aim for but very few actually manage to maintain. My father managed a herd of dairy cattle, while my mother directed our home with the flawless efficiency of someone who had been training for the role under her own mother since the age of 12. Being the second of 7 children meant my childhood was an endless loop of supervising the younger siblings while still remaining accountable to the older ones. In a large family, a middle child quickly discovers that their personal desires exist at the end of a long line, and you learn to wait quietly for your turn. For the most part, I found comfort in that life. I cherished my brothers and sisters, took comfort in the predictable choreography of our daily chores, and found peace in knowing exactly what duties the next sunrise would demand of me. Our paths first crossed at a youth singing during the autumn of my 21st year. Jonas was 24 at the time, which was notably older than the age most young men in our district chose to marry. His prolonged single status had sparked a quiet current of gossip among the older women, the sort of subtle speculation that never speaks its mind directly, but is conveyed entirely through a raised eyebrow or a meaningful pause during a quilting circle. They wondered why such an exceptional, upstanding man had not yet established his own home, assuming there must be some hidden flaw. Yet there was no visible defect in him, or at least not in the version he presented to the public, which I would eventually recognize as an incredibly disciplined construct. At 21, I simply lacked the maturity to see the effort behind his composure. That evening, he bypassed the usual hesitant rituals of our peers and approached me with a directness that caught me off guard. Most young men in our social circle were cautious to the point of absolute paralysis, so terrified of appearing forward that they wrapped every conversation in layers of neutral pleasantries. You could converse with someone for a year and still have no inkling of their true intentions. Jonas was entirely different. Within 10 minutes of introducing himself, he asked if he could drive me home in his buggy at the end of the night. My immediate acceptance was accompanied by a wave of relief. I remember thinking how wonderful it was to finally encounter a man who possessed the courage to say exactly what he meant. I held fast to that perception for 19 months, completely unaware that stating your intentions and exposing your internal emotions are two entirely separate capabilities, and that Jonas had only developed the former. From an outsider's perspective, our courtship was flawless. Jonas demonstrated every quality a young woman was conditioned to respect. He was perfectly punctual, recalled minor details from conversations we had shared weeks prior, and showed immense kindness toward my younger siblings. He was the kind of man who would happily kneel in the dirt to explain the mechanics of a buggy wheel to a 6-year-old, rather than ignoring the interruption. My father respected him, and my mother championed him even more. Within half a year, our entire social circle took it for granted that we would wed, despite the fact that no formal proposal had occurred, because in a small community, consensus always gathers quietly, in the background long before it is spoken aloud. Yet, looking back, there were subtle anomalies that I failed to interpret correctly at the time, moments that contained the blueprint of his entire internal struggle. I recall an evening about 8 months into our relationship when I casually inquired about his deepest fears. It was a standard question meant to map the boundaries of each other's inner lives, and I anticipated a standard response regarding a ruined crop, a economic hardship, or the passing of a loved one. Jonas remained silent for a lengthy interval before stating flatly that he simply chose not to entertain such thoughts. I laughed it off, assuming he was merely displaying the charming modesty or evasiveness common among young men, and nudged him further. When he turned to look at me, an expression flickered across his features that I couldn't categorize, a brief shadow that was instantly smoothed over by his trademark serenity. He quietly explained that he had learned it was far healthier not to focus on negative possibilities. I dropped the subject, attributing the response to a stable, unflappable temperament that remained untroubled by the trivial anxieties plaguing ordinary people. I deeply respected that quality, failing to realize I had just watched a door lock against a part of his soul I was forbidden to visit. There were other indications, such as the seamless, effortless manner in which he would steer the conversation away whenever it touched upon his own upbringing, or the way his mother, a well-intentioned but visibly exhausted woman, would freeze completely whenever Jonas was mentioned in certain contexts. I observed these silences, but chose not to question them, insulated by youth and my profound affection for the flawless version of the man I had been permitted to see. That flawless presentation was the very mechanism Jonas had constructed to survive his own existence. I remember a specific afternoon during our first year together when we were participating in a barn raising a few miles away. The labor was grueling, leaving everyone with aching muscles, and during the process of positioning a massive timber, it slipped from the workman's grasp and plummeted down with terrifying speed, missing Jonas by a matter of inches. Every single man in the immediate vicinity reacted instinctively with a shout, a panicked flinch, and the violent retreat that the human body makes when facing sudden peril. Jonas never moved an inch. He merely stepped aside with a chilling calmness, as though he had calculated the exact trajectory of the falling wood long before it gave way. The other men laughed in relief afterward, slapping his back and declaring him the most level-headed man in the entire county. Watching from a distance, a cold knot of anxiety formed in my stomach, though I quickly dismissed it because everyone else was celebrating his reaction as a testament to his fortitude. I questioned my own right, as a young woman in the middle of courtship, to wonder if a person who fails to flinch in the face of death might be suffering from a deeper wound. I convinced myself that his stillness was merely the byproduct of a profound, unshakable faith. I did not yet understand that I was looking at a nervous system that had been conditioned from early childhood to absorb sudden terror in absolute silence rather than responding naturally. In certain households, a child who displays visible terror learns very quickly that showing vulnerability invites an even greater danger. Jonas had absorbed that lesson decades before our paths ever crossed, and he had executed it so perfectly that our entire community mistook his trauma for spiritual strength. There was also the constant motion of his hands. I noticed, without understanding its meaning until much later, that he was incapable of sitting in total stillness. While his face remained a mask of absolute serenity, his fingers were constantly active whenever he believed no one was paying attention, folding a scrap of fabric over and over, or tracing rhythmic, repetitive designs against his trousers. It was a localized restlessness thriving beneath a placid surface. At the time, I found it quite charming, viewing it as a quirky habit in an otherwise unbothered man. I had no idea I was looking at the only outlet where his physical body was permitted to express its true state of agitation. We were wed that October, enveloped by hundreds of neighbors who sincerely wished us well, and believed, based on every outward sign Jonas had provided, that I was stepping into an enviable life of security. I want to speak with absolute honesty about what transpired once we were alone in that house, because it explains everything, and I have no desire to sensationalize it or diminish its true weight. This is a story about uncovering, in the most vulnerable moment two human beings can experience, that your partner has spent his entire life suppressing a massive burden, and that keeping it hidden was the absolute prerequisite for his survival in our world. When we were finally left to ourselves, the aroma of the fresh cedar dower chests stacked in the corner filled the room. Jonas fell into a deep silence that I initially attributed to the natural solemnity and gravity of the occasion. For the first hour, as we conversed in low tones and shared a piece of our wedding cake, the atmosphere felt incredibly gentle. But as the night progressed toward the intimacy expected of a husband and wife, I noticed his hands begin to tremble. It wasn't a violent shaking, but rather a subtle, internal vibration that could easily be overlooked unless you were watching him with absolute focus, which I was. When I softly inquired if he was doing all right, his affirmative response came far too rapidly, carrying the hollow tone people use when the reality is far more tortuous. Having spent 19 months learning the cadence of his voice, I knew instantly that he was in distress. I chose not to press him, a decision rooted in everything I had been taught about the sanctity of marriage. A wife was expected to safeguard and honor her husband's dignity, not cross-examine it. I sat quietly beside him and watched as the trembling grew more pronounced, and an expression crossed his face that had never appeared during our entire acquaintance. It was sheer, unadulterated terror, not the ordinary, expected awkwardness of a young man, which I would have met with patience. This was a primal, animalistic panic that caused his entire frame to go rigid and his eyes to look completely vacant. My husband, celebrated as the most composed soul in our district, sat on the edge of our bed and transformed into a total stranger. When I whispered his name, it took a long time for him to respond, and when he did, his voice sounded fractured, incredibly young and small. He looked at me and confessed that he needed to reveal something, but he was terrified that once the truth was out, I would no longer want him as my husband. A suffocating fear of my own gripped my chest, the terrifying sensation of standing on a precipice where a single sentence can demolish your entire understanding of reality. I forced my voice to remain steady, telling him to speak his mind, and promising that whatever lay ahead, we would navigate it as a unit, just as we had vowed before God and our community hours earlier. On the very night I believed would be the effortless fulfillment of our perfect courtship, my husband unburdened himself about his childhood. I will recount his words because they represent the true core of this journey and reveal an unsettling reality about our upbringing that is far too often cloaked in silence. Jonas was the third of 9 children. His father was a man I had encountered a few times during our courtship, someone who had always seemed stern but entirely unremarkable within our world, where a certain stoic hardness is viewed as the proper standard for patriarchs. I had absolutely no inkling of how that man actually governed his home until that night. In a voice that repeatedly broke, hesitated, and restarted, Jonas described a father whose methods of discipline went far beyond acceptable boundaries of firmness. He detailed what it was like to be a young boy discovering that the most trivial mistakes, a dropped tool in the barn, an incorrect response to a question, or a momentary lapse in focus, would trigger consequences that left him living in terror for days, dreading the mere sound of his father entering a room. He explained that his mother attempted to mitigate the severity where she could, but she was trapped in her own state of perpetual fear. That terror drifted through the entire household like an inescapable fog, dominating their lives while never being acknowledged aloud. Jonas realized at a very tender age that his sole means of survival was to project an image of absolute stillness, giving his father absolutely no emotional leverage to react against. He practiced this concealment with the intense dedication another child might give to mastering an instrument, systematically training his facial expressions, his tone of voice, and his physical posture to betray absolutely no internal emotion. Showing even a flicker of normal childish frustration had once carried a dangerous cost. The tragic irony was that his defense mechanism had worked flawlessly. He had molded himself into a man of such immense composure that our neighbors viewed his lack of emotion as a spiritual triumph, holding him up as the gold standard of an upright character. No one in our district ever paused to wonder why a 24-year-old man was entirely devoid of normal human anxieties or rough edges. In our environment, that degree of uniformity is always interpreted as a sign of deep faith, rather than what it truly was. The psychological defense system of a child who had constructed a flawless persona out of the desperate need to remain invisible to a dangerous parent. He had never shared this secret with a single living soul, not his minister, nor his closest companions, until that very moment. He confessed that he couldn't begin our marriage without telling me, because the prospect of lowering his guard completely in front of another human being terrified him beyond measure. He desperately wanted me to understand that his panic was not a rejection of me, because he truly desired our union. He was simply terrified of what would happen to his psyche when he could no longer tightly regulate how he was perceived. I remained on the edge of the mattress with my new husband for a long time, holding his trembling hands in absolute silence because I required that space to process the weight of his words. Some revelations demand a period of quiet before they can be fully absorbed. Eventually, I told him that I was completely committed to our life together. I explained that I understood far more than he realized about the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a false persona for a world that only values the exhibition and cares nothing for the actual person beneath it. Every young woman in our society encounters her own version of that performance, even if it is shaped differently than his. I assured him that I had no desire for him to be an unshakable monument, and that I would infinitely prefer to share my life with the authentic, trembling reality of who he was than spend a lifetime beside a polished mask. Hearing those words, he broke down and wept. That detail is incredibly important, because a man who had spent his entire existence conditioning his body to never exhibit vulnerability or weakness let his tears fall freely in front of me on our wedding night. That shared vulnerability became the most profoundly intimate event of that evening, far surpassing any physical union that followed, because it marked the first instance in his existence where he exposed his true self to another person and was met with acceptance rather than punishment or disgust. We did not follow the traditional expectations of a newly married couple that night. Instead, we spent the hours conversing deeply until the candles dissolved into pools of wax, and the first gray slivers of dawn illuminated the room. He shared specific memories, including the fact that at 24, he could still pinpoint the exact sound of his father's footsteps from anywhere in a building, a sound that still caused his stomach to drop, even though his father hadn't laid a hand on him in a decade. I shared my own experiences regarding my family, which had been far more affectionate but carried its own unique burdens, specifically the heavy expectation of being a middle daughter who had to learn how to be constantly useful and entirely unobtrusive to find value. Through those hours of darkness, we forged a genuine connection that was far deeper and more resilient than the conventional romance our wedding night was supposed to hold. It was a more complicated form of intimacy, but one that I have come to see as far more permanent. As the early morning light shifted from a cold gray to a warm gold through the fabric of the curtains, Jonas quietly asked if I felt any regret about my choice to marry him. He posed the question with the hesitant tone of someone who has already braced themselves for the worst possible outcome, expecting confirmation of his deepest fears. I answered with an unshakable negative, and I meant it with my entire soul. But I also confessed something else that had only crystallized for me as the words left my mouth. I felt remarkably less isolated in that room than I had during our entire 19-month courtship. For nearly 2 years, I had been growing attached to a well-intentioned performance, and there's a distinct, quiet loneliness that comes with loving an illusion, even when you cannot quite pinpoint what is missing from the picture. I had carried that unnameable distance within me, a subtle barrier that made our closest moments feel like trying to touch someone through a sheet of glass. In that room, the glass was finally shattered. There was only the authentic, frightened reality of the man before me, and the relief of that truth swept away every anxiety I had carried across the threshold. He gazed at me for a long time before admitting that he had always believed being completely transparent would result in his total destruction. He had operated under the assumption that the manufactured persona of the calm, untroubled Jonas was the only structure preventing his collapse, and that if anyone ever peered behind the facade, they would find nothing but ruins. Instead, the exact opposite had occurred. For the first time in his memory, he felt like a cohesive, whole human being rather than a fragmented collection of defensive behaviors designed to evade harm. The wedding night was merely the opening chapter of a much larger journey. A childhood spent training your mind and body into absolute emotional suppression cannot be undone in a single night of honesty. During the initial years of our marriage, old habits frequently reasserted themselves. In the midst of ordinary disagreements, Jonas would suddenly retreat into that familiar, terrifying stillness, locking his emotions away and presenting me with that pleasant, compliant surface he gave to the rest of the world. I had to learn, through a long process of trial and error, how to identify the exact moment that emotional barrier was sliding into place, and how to gently invite him to step back out into the open. There were nights when his deeply rooted fears would resurface without any conscious trigger, causing him to bolt upright in the darkness with a racing pulse from nightmares he couldn't recall. In those moments, I learned that questions were useless. He required nothing but my physical presence. I distinctly recall one such night around our 4th year of marriage, when our oldest child was still an infant, and our home was heavy with the profound fatigue unique to new parents. Jonas woke up in a state of sudden panic, gasping for air in the dark, entirely disoriented. I softly spoke his name and waited patiently. It took an agonizing minute for his eyes to align with mine and for his surroundings to ground him. He immediately began to apologize, which was his standard response back then, treating his residual trauma as an unfair burden he was inflicting upon me rather than an involuntary echo of his past. I reminded him then, as I did many times after, that he never needed to seek forgiveness for what his body remembered. That compulsion to apologize was simply an extension of his old survival tactics, another layer of armor devised by a child who had learned that displaying distress was a liability that needed to be handled in secret to avoid provoking further rage. Over the course of years, those apologies began to fade away, replaced by a willingness to simply let me comfort him until his heart rate normalized, without the need to vocalize shame over his vulnerability. Our path also wound through much more difficult terrain. During our 7th year together, Jonas's father became gravely ill, a protracted decline that forced my husband to spend hours at his childhood homestead, managing the heavy farm labor his father could no longer execute. Being pulled back into that physical space, the very rooms where his childhood terror had been systematically manufactured, caused his old defensive stillness to return with immense power. He became incredibly distant during those months, retreating so far behind his old mask that it terrified me, making it feel as though the progress we had achieved together had vanished. I refused to let that silence settle between us. I consistently and directly asked him what was occurring behind his placid eyes, even when he initially attempted to deflect me with his practiced composure. By that stage in our marriage, I had developed the stamina to wait him out without pulling away, remaining steadily by his side without forcing the lock before he was internally prepared to open it. It required nearly 3 months of patient presence before he finally confessed that walking through that house, even as an adult with a family of his own, triggered an instinctive, animalistic expectation of danger that his rational mind knew was no longer there. He expressed a deep self-hatred for still being held captive by those ancient memories when he felt he should have outgrown them long ago. I assured him that emotional healing does not adhere to a rigid timeline, and that still being impacted by profound childhood wounds was not a sign of failure, but a sign of his humanity. Recovery is almost never a neat, linear progression from brokenness to wholeness. It is far more akin to an upward spiral, where you find yourself revisiting old sources of pain from shifting perspectives, equipped each time with a slightly greater capacity to endure and integrate the experience than before. We eventually recognized the need for external support, though that resource looked vastly different in our community than it does in mainstream society. Traditional old order districts do not utilize professional psychological services, but we do possess an informal network of ministers, deacons, and experienced couples who quietly handle counseling needs. We were fortunate to connect with an elder minister living 2 districts away, who was widely respected for his profound empathy, rather than a rigid adherence to rules, and he became someone Jonas could finally trust with his story. It required 2 full years of dialogue before he was able to fully articulate his past to this man, dismantling the remaining walls, piece by piece. If you have survived a reality where your internal truth had to be buried for your own protection, please know that you are not broken for carrying those scars. True strength lies in the quiet endurance it took to make it through, and the path to becoming a whole person is one you never have to walk entirely alone.